Hey, you're here with Dr. Jodi, and this is season 2 of Anxiety. I am so done with you. This podcast is a teen and young adult guide to ditching toxic stress and hardwiring your brain for happiness. If you're new here, grab a copy of my book, Anxiety, I'm So Done With You, because this series is following section by section through the book, going a little bit deeper, giving more examples, and telling more stories. Season 2, which follows along with Chapter 2, is going through the lies that anxiety, depression, and negative thinking tell you to get you to believe them. Once you know what they are, you can see them coming a mile away and call them out. That way they can no longer sucker punch you with their toxicity. I appreciate you for listening, subscribing, and leaving me 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. If I've helped you at all, spread the word about this book and this podcast series. Mental health problems are invisible, so you never know who is struggling around you, and you sharing can make a huge difference in their lives. We are starting Chapter 2. I'm done with your lies. This is Chapter 2, lie number 1. You have to know what's wrong. Before we dive into that section, I just want to take a moment here to observe. Take a long, deep, cleansing breath. Feel your shoulders drop as you exhale. Feel your face around your mouth relax. Doesn't that feel good? Do it again. Give yourself a little kudos for getting this far. Thank yourself for the time that you've spent and that you invested in yourself. You are amazing. How's it going so far? Now, every episode of this podcast has a blog post that goes with it. It has the transcription and all the resources, and on the bottom, there's a comment section. You could tell me, what did you like the best about Chapter 1? What have you noticed about your anxiety? What have you noticed about your hopefulness? What do you notice about its intensity? What do you notice about your negative self-judgments? We spend so much time trying to avoid our feelings, but when we do that, we can never process them and then get to the other side of them. Luckily, there's another way. You can witness them. Witnessing them means you have a bit of distance and you're noticing yourself instead of feeling inside the chaos of something that you're experiencing. When you're inside your feelings, you're in panic mode and you're scrambling to get yourself back in control, and you're not as conscientious in your choice of coping strategies. However, when you witness yourself from outside of the feelings, you could feel your feelings fully and watch them. And in watching them, everything changes because your monkey mind is not going, oh my gosh, we're going to have to fix this. Oh my gosh, what's this? What's this? And then we have to do this. And then we have to do this. And what if this happens? And what if this happens? And what if this happens? When you're observing, you have distance. So you're away from the chaos, looking at it from the outside. You're less in your mind and more in your body, and that's why the monkey has very little control. It's not trying to figure it out. You're observing, you're noticing, you're discerning, which is distinctly different than the monkey overthinking, and that makes all the difference. Reflect on your relationship with anxiety now that you're done with Chapter 1. Now that we demystified anxiety, where we told you what exactly it is and where it came from. Is there more space in your life to breathe, to think, to plan, to look forward to things? What connections have you made since you started this journey? What activities are you reclaiming and bringing back into your life that anxiety got rid of? You know, anxiety wants you to isolate yourself because when you're isolated, you are more vulnerable. When you're isolated, the negativity in your head gets a life of its own. When you're with other people, you get out of your head and it doesn't start to spiral and make you feel worse and worse and worse. Either you're focused on somebody else's problems, you're focused on the task at hand, or someone's reminding you that you're blowing things out of proportion. Not in a way that they're judging you, but they're just saying, oh, I feel like that too, and you don't feel so crazy. When you're with other people and not isolated, that negativity in your head just doesn't have the same kind of power. You're distracted. You have something else for your brain to do. And you also realize you're just like everyone else. You don't feel so different. Anxiety wants you to think that you're different because that feels out of control. It makes you feel less than. It makes you not trust yourself, and anxiety needs you not to trust yourself. Enter Chapter 2. In Chapter 2, we are continuing to deconstruct anxiety. In Chapter 1, you learned where it came from, and in Chapter 2, we're going to learn its tricks and its tactics. Let me tell you the background of this and how I discovered that anxiety is a liar. The therapeutic approach that I use in my practice is called narrative therapy. It was developed by Michael White and David Epstein, and it is a very powerful and transformative therapeutic modality. If you're working with a therapist who does narrative approaches, you may not even know that that's what they're doing because it just seems like the therapist is curious and asking you questions. Well, that is what's happening. The therapist is curious and they are asking you questions because it's a talk therapy. However, they're specific questions leading you on a map somewhere, from what is known and familiar to what is possible to know. What is known and familiar about your problems is how you see them, how you experience them, and what meaning you have given them. What's possible to know is how else you can see yourself despite them. Narrative therapy is how I learned to take the power down from anxiety and give it back to yourself. When I was working with kids and teens and adults with anxiety, I would create a document. I would take a piece of paper out, and on one side, I'd list all the tricks and tactics of anxiety, and on the other side, I'd list a person's skills and knowledges. I learned this technique from David Epstein. When I was listing the tricks and tactics of anxiety, I would include the things that anxiety says to get you to believe it. I would include what anxiety tells you that could go wrong, what anxiety tells about the worst case scenario, how it brings questions in your mind and puts doubts to you that things could go okay. All of these and more. This essentially is an expose on anxiety. You're exposing anxiety for what it's doing. You're calling it out. The therapist is like the investigative reporter, trying to find out all of the ways anxiety messes with your life. In this way, it deconstructs it, makes those all visible, and when they're visible in a list like that, they seem ridiculous. You could see how they're not true. And as I was writing this list, the tricks and tactics of anxiety, or the tricks and tactics of nervousness, or what the worries were up to, I started to notice that they told people things. The nervousness, the anxiety, the worries, whatever the person called their anxiety, told people things that were not true. And then when we started the column of the person's skills and knowledges, we would put in that column that we knew the things that anxiety says was not true. And then I started to realize that the biggest tactic of anxiety was lying. It lies about you. It lies about what could happen. It lies about what you could handle. It lies about everything. That was its tactic, to lie. And I started to notice as I made these documents with more and more clients that anxiety uses the same or very similar lies to everyone. Anxiety might be experienced by people in different ways, but it uses the same tactics. So in my first book, I don't know if y'all know, but I did write another book before Anxiety, I'm So Done With You. I wrote a book called You Won Anxiety Zero, meaning that you win the game. I use the metaphor of a game in order to call anxiety out as an opponent and to empower the human through their competitive nature. I also use it to lighten up people's approach to their anxiety recovery. This has a bonus of relaxing the person and increasing the neuroplasticity, getting them ready for a change in beliefs and emotional patterns. In that book, I outline 15 lies, 15 common lies that anxiety tells. And I'm going to read them to you now because I think they're really interesting. There is, of course, a huge Venn diagram of overlapping information, but there's a couple more lies. In this book, I list 7. In that book, 15. Here are the 15 lies that anxiety tells, aka the tricks and tactics that anxiety uses on you. And I'm using the word anxiety as a catch-all for all of these different things that we experience that work on us the same way. Anxiety says, I protect you. Anxiety uses black and white thinking. Anxiety evasively threatens, it'll be awful. Anxiety insists that this is real. This is important. Anxiety convinces you that you are going crazy. Anxiety discourages you by saying, why bother? There's no point. Anxiety makes you forget what you know. Anxiety scares you. Anxiety terrorizes you when you are most vulnerable. Anxiety tells you that you are untrustworthy. Anxiety cuts you down. Anxiety tries to confuse you. Anxiety disguises itself. Anxiety does not want you to talk about it. And anxiety tells you you can't handle it. You probably recognize some of those from Anxiety, I'm So Done With You. But if you wanted to go deeper or hear more stories to help illustrate these, or if you know an adult who needs this information and they don't want to read Anxiety, I'm So Done With You, U1 Anxiety Zero is available. The link is below in the show notes. Again, it's called U1 Anxiety Zero. Win your life back from fear and panic. All right, let's get into section 1. The lie that we're talking about in this section is you have to know what's wrong. To figure out what to do about it, you have to figure out what is wrong. This comes from a systems metaphor. Someone presented a theory of our body and our mind being a system. They used the metaphor of a system to help you understand your brain and your body and the relationship of both of those. This is more like a medical model. So in the medical model, you find out what's wrong, and then you fix it, and then the system could continue to function. So theorists thought it might be prudent to look at your mental health the same way. We're going along in life, and then something goes wrong, and so you have to find out what the problem is, fix it, and then the system could continue as it was going. That's the metaphor. You're going along, something goes wrong, you have to figure out what it is, fix it so that the system could continue the way it was going before. This metaphor doesn't necessarily track with mental health, but it's been ingrained in us. It makes us, or more appropriately, the monkey, try to figure out what's wrong so it could save our lives. This trying to figure out what's wrong, again, is a major distraction. You're thinking, why am I like this? Why is it me? Why am I different than other people? What's wrong with me? There's nothing for you here. It just takes you down into the rabbit hole of trying to figure stuff out and making things up that are negative about yourself. It also perpetuates this eternal conflict. You can't help it because it's an anxiety disorder. There's something wrong with your brain. Versus that individualistic value that we should be taking care of ourselves. And if something's wrong with us, then it's our responsibility and we have to fix it. This idea that we have to figure out what is wrong with us encourages labeling. Labels are damaging. They define you, which means they're definitive. Definitive means there's only one way. There's no flexibility. There's no changeability in something definitive because it's definitive. It's done. It's a conclusion. And when something's done, there's 2 problems. 1 is that there's no hope. And 2, that you have negative identity conclusions. That means you make negative conclusions about your identity. You take that in, you internalize it as if it's you. I'm wrong. I'm a loser. I'm damaged. You are not a loser. You are not damaged. You are not a problem. The problem is the problem. You are a person experiencing a problem. See, in this way, the problem is a description of what you're feeling or what you're experiencing. So when I use the words like anxiety and depression, I'm using them as a description of what you're experiencing, not as a label on you or a label of the thing. That's why the titles of my 2 books, You1 Anxiety Zero and Anxiety I'm So Done With You, both personify anxiety. And I do that on purpose because it's therapeutic just to read the titles of these books. I'm taking anxiety outside of your identity and giving it its own identity. It's called externalizing. So you could see it and start to relate to it differently. This is a huge way we disempower anxiety and give the power back to yourself. It's really crucial because anxiety hides behind you. Anxiety wants you to think that it's you doing it, that it's you saying that to help yourself or protect yourself. It wants you to think that you are helping yourself instead of anxiety trying to mess up your life. A new client this week told me that they were in a rut. That was their way to describe their experience. I'm in a rut. He brought a metaphor to the conversation. A metaphor is an idea, and it's very helpful, whereas a truth is rigid and limited and not at all helpful. Metaphors are limitless. They can be developed and changed and expanded. Truths are definitive. There's no change. There's no malleability. There's nothing you could do. Being in a rut is a metaphor. It helps you understand the big picture. I love metaphors because if you think about being in the rut, you could ask questions like, how did I get in the rut? What made the rut? What can you do to your tires to make them less vulnerable to getting into a rut? How would you get on a road that doesn't have as many ruts? Metaphors give you a distance from the situation. It's not you messing up your life. It's you trying to figure out how not to get in a rut. This person was really specific not to call it anything because he didn't know what it was and he didn't want to distract himself trying to figure out what it was. It felt like a rut, so he called it a rut. I love that. Describing a problem instead of labeling it keeps you empowered instead of disempowered. This is important because anxiety is a liar and it uses intimidating words to disempower you. It doesn't only hide behind you, but it hides behind these other words and labels. Here are some examples that I listed in this section. Fear, worry, worrier, worrywart, nervousness, anxiety, panic, shyness, mental illness, mental health, emotional, stuck, weak, shook, immobilized, irritable, resistant, impatient, in a rut, frustrated, disassociated, obsessed, grieving, and so much more. I'm actually not going to read them all because I could go on and on and on. I listed 2 pages of these in the book. Why do you think I'm telling you this list? Why is it important to know that these things are all anxiety? It's not. It's not important that you know that these things are anxiety, but it's important for you to know that anxiety is using some of them as a tactic, and these are working on you in the same way anxiety works on you. Trying to get your attention, trying to make you feel powerless, trying to get you not to trust yourself, making you think that they're real, or making you think that something's wrong with you, leaving you wondering or not understanding, scrambling to make meaning around them. Let me pose the question again. Are all of these anxiety? Yes, remember, all upsetness is the same hormone of adrenaline. All upsetness. All of these things are ways to describe upsetness. Yes, you feel them differently. There are different heavinesses on your heart because of the meaning that you make around them. However, if one of these things is dominant in your life, is around a lot more than it needs to be, if it hurts you or is upsetting you, then you could deconstruct it just like you deconstruct anxiety. You can use any names that resonate with you, but use them as a description of your experience instead of a label. Thinking of them as relative, not definitive. That way you can understand them as changeable. You can think of them as being more or less present in different contexts, that they come and they go, that they have more influence over you sometimes and less influence over you other times. This is a good place to mention diagnoses. Diagnoses come out of that medical model. The diagnosis informs the chosen course of medical treatment. In many traditional psychological approaches to mental health treatment, they still think this, that the mental health diagnosis informs the mental health treatment. However, this doesn't hold up as many evidence-based modalities help with tons of different kinds of problems. And as a social worker, that medical model doesn't fit with how I see the world anyway and how I understand people. From the social work or social justice perspective, the medical model is othering. There are people who are mentally ill and others who are not. What does that remind you of? This enacts supremacy and privilege and invalidates people. It doesn't take into account a person's skills and abilities. It doesn't take into account the context of our life. And so it doesn't take into account the problems of our society that's creating those contexts. It creates a greater power differential between the practitioner and the patient because the practitioner is seen as an expert. Diagnosing is also damaging because it puts negative labels on us. Social workers see that people have agency and authority, that they are the expert of their own life. While I am somebody who can give somebody a mental health diagnosis, I don't relish it and I rarely ever do it. After 26 years of practice, I've come to understand that the diagnosis has a purpose. Payment. You need a diagnosis to get insurances to pay for the sessions. Or you might need a diagnosis to qualify to get some services. Other than those, there's no other practical reason why you need a diagnosis. But there are more reasons why you don't need one. I spend so much time with people deconstructing these labels once they're attached. Once we bring those labels into our heart and into our identity, it makes us feel horrible. And it takes a lot of work to undo that meaning making. Sometimes people love to have a diagnosis. They're like, at least I know what I have. And in some ways, it's a validation. I've been struggling and struggling. I've been wondering what was wrong with me. And now that I have the diagnosis, I understand. And they feel validated. It's like somebody sees the struggle that I have. And also, when people have a diagnosis, it's like, now I have something to fight. Now I know what it is. I have something to fight. That's because it's really distracting to be like, what is wrong with me? What is wrong with me? That's the whole section of this book is anxiety wants you to get real distracted by trying to figure out exactly what is wrong. Having a diagnosis solves that for you and makes you feel better, temporarily. After a while, it starts to affect how you see yourself. In the long run, it's not necessarily helpful. This book presents another way to have that validation and have something to fight because we externalize anxiety. We know it's relative. We know it comes up and down. We know it influences your life. We know it has tricks and tactics that get you to believe it. We know it lies like heck. We know it's a big bully. That should give you validation and give you something to fight, but it doesn't put a label on you. It doesn't encourage you to have negative identity conclusions about yourself. It doesn't affect how you see yourself. Actually, that's not true. It affects how you see yourself, but in a positive way. There's an old video I recorded called I'm a Mess, and it explains this really well. I embedded that video in the blog post that goes along with this episode, and the link to that is in the show notes. Before we close this episode, there's one more thing that I want to say about diagnoses. Diagnoses are subjective, not objective. As much as some people act like they're objective, they are not. You could go to 3 or 4 different clinicians and get 3 or 4 different diagnoses. And if you've ever read the DSM, that's the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, you'd think, wow, that sounds like me, and that sounds like me, and that sounds like me, and that sounds like me. Plus, ADD or OCD or anxiety or depression or borderline look totally different in different people. How do you explain that? They manifest totally different in different people. This is the takeaway that I want you to have from this episode and from this section of the book. You are you. You are so much more amazing than the anxiety wants you to think you are. Now that we're uncovering all of these lies, the next time anxiety tries to use them on you, you're going to see them coming a mile away. You're going to think, wait a minute, that's not right. That's something the anxiety is saying. Do I want to believe that or not? Not. Instead of doubting yourself, you're going to be doubting anxiety. Thank you so much for listening to this episode, Chapter 2, Section 1. You have to know what's wrong. If one of those 15 lies that I talked about in U1 Anxiety 0 sparked your interest and you're like, I really need to get a little bit more information about that one, all those lies are covered in my Anxiety Free Me online program. If you're interested in that, a link to that program is going to be in the show notes. In this episode, we talked about that bully of anxiety being such a big liar. And we talked about this lie, you have to know what's wrong, that really wreaks havoc with your psyche. I appreciate you for subscribing, commenting, and rating me 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. In the next episode, we're going to be covering lie number 2, you have to look at me. So read Chapter 2, Section 2, and I'll meet you there.